I'm really excited to be here at Tech Open Air. This is the first time I'm doing a talk here, and I think this is a really relevant topic. When I tried to think about what I wanted to say within 15 minutes, I thought it's probably best to just start with a pretty short little story about my 5-year-old nephew. So, my nephew is one of my favorite people in the entire world. Every single time I'm over at his place, though, his parents make it so that I can never spend any time with him. And the reason that I can never spend any time with him is because they've given him one of these or an iPad to babysit him. So no matter how much I talk to him, and no matter how much I say, hey, do you want to play? Hey, do you want to go eat something? Hey, do you want to go do whatever? He refuses to look up from his iPad. And he's 5. So what I find myself saying to him all the time is, you know what? Can you please just pay attention? And that phrase to me, when I first started thinking about it, made very little sense. So whenever we ask people, whenever we say, hey, can you guys pay attention? What does that mean? It almost implies like we're dealing with some sort of currency, right? Like you're paying attention to me right now, supposedly, except I think there's like one guy up there on his phone who's not paying attention right now, but that's the world we live in, right? The question that I have, and that most people have today, is if I want people to pay attention to what I'm doing, what I'm saying, and what I'm sharing, what do I have to offer in return, right? The question really is, what are we bartering? So, let's think about what the world is like today for a little bit. So today, the world is completely at your fingertips. Now, we're at this amazing conference, and we're learning all these great things. But let's just be honest. You guys could have stayed at home, and then once this conference was over, you could have just pulled out your phone, and you could have watched every single talk that's happening here right now. You didn't actually have to be here to get any of the content downloaded into your heads. That's an interesting place to be here in life, right? That you don't have to physically be present to actually start understanding the things that are going on. In fact, almost any piece of information that you could want is readily available at your fingertips at any given time. Now, most of the people, as I'm looking around here, are within their 20s and their 30s, and that firmly puts us in the place of what they call the millennial generation. And let's be honest, they talk a lot of shit about us millennials. They say that we don't pay attention. They say, and I quote, we have the attention of goldfish. Now, let me ask you guys, is that actually true? Well, I think what the data would say is that that probably doesn't make any sense. On average, what people don't seem to recognize is that these mobile devices that we have, these phones, now comprise about 5 to 6 hours of our daily attention. Think about that for just 1 minute. You spend roughly 5 to 6 hours every single day on that device in some way, shape, or form. Think about how many times you even pick that thing up. On average, people say that you pick up a phone between 150 to 200 times a day, every single day. So knowing that, we have this real question about what attention actually is. Are people paying attention to anything in particular? Are they looking at their screens for any specific purpose? Or are these just ways for us to waste time? So roughly, if you guys remember reading any of this stuff from about 10 years ago, 10 years ago, they told us that we had reached peak attention. So what is peak attention? They said because of the advent of email and of text messaging, that people could no longer handle any more information coming into them. That was 10 years ago, guys. What happened slightly after? Enter Facebook, enter Twitter, enter Instagram, enter Snapchat. We've started to have all this different content and all these different informational flows exponentially increasing what we see almost every single day. And yet, physically, we're still here. Mentally, though, I think that's up for debate. I don't know where people actually are. So as we've entered what we call the mobile first / me first era, things have changed. Our attention spans have supposedly gotten slower, and what the data shows for that is that supposedly we don't like doing cognitive tasks for any longer than 5 minutes at a time. So we're in this world today where we have physical presence, mental overload, and we don't want to spend more than 5 minutes on any single thing, but we're willing to spend 5 to 6 hours in total doing all sorts of different things. So if that's the use case, how do we move around? How do we actually capture people's behavior? And how do we actually navigate through unlimited content? Because like we said at the beginning of this talk, the world's at your fingertips now. You can do almost anything. You can see almost anything. You can access almost anything just by picking up your phone. So I'm going to get a little bit geeky with you guys for just a second. So on average, if you were to take the total input of every single sensory and auditory data stream that you have coming toward you, so things that you're seeing right now, like me in front of you, things that you're hearing, like me on this mic, things that you're feeling, like maybe the person sitting next to you, these are just some of the tactile sensations that you have. But if you add up every single thing that's happening to you, people say on average that we're hitting about 16 to 18 million bits of information hitting the human brain every single second. Now, that is a massive amount of information that we're trying to process. And the average human being only processes somewhere between 130 to 160 bits per second. So just think about that. The information loss is absolutely massive. And so what we have to do in today's world to kind of survive, and what we've always had to do as human beings, is we had to put on a pair of blinders. We had to pick the things that were important for us to understand, for us to recognize, so we can barely just survive, right? So an interesting story or interesting paradigm for this is actually thinking about a newborn baby. So when a baby's born, for the first 3 to 6 months of their life, what do? Well, did somebody have an answer? I didn't know this was interactive, but that's cool. Shout out answers. Eat and sleep. That's all they do, right? And there's the back end of the eating part too, but yes. But have you ever stopped to think why they sleep so much? So traditionally, people have always believed that they sleep because there's growth happening at all the times. But interestingly enough, think about this. Babies have not yet developed a nervous system to the point where they can do pattern recognition, meaning that they have so much unlimited information coming in at all given times that they're not able to figure out what's relevant and what's not. And so they have to sleep to actually allow their neural cortex in their brain to grow so that eventually they can figure out what to pay attention to and what not to. That amount of information absolutely just overloads them. So if this is the case that we have today, where we have all this information, and even us as adults, we were used to a certain type of information coming in, and we were used to a certain type of life, and now we've exponentially just blown that up. How do we handle that? Well, what happens in that kind of situation is that society changes, right? If you think about what the world is like today, keep in mind that this device is less than 10 years old. And think about what our society as a whole has changed in that time. And so what I like to use as a lens for that society is economics, right? So my background here is as a behavioral economist. I care a lot about the decisions that people make and how they make them and why they make them. So everybody hears the term the economy thrown around all the time. And the economy means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. But the way that I'll define it for you guys today is an economy is just a collection of people's behaviors in aggregate, right? We collect all of our behaviors together, and the output of that is what we analyze or organize as an economy. How do we measure that? Well, primarily people talk about utility. When you talk about maximal economic outcomes, you think about maximization of utility. That means that people get to do the things that they want to do. And historically speaking, the best societies have emerged when people were able to be empowered to do the things that they were able to do. So if that's our lens, we have to think about how we measure utility, right? And how have we traditionally measured utility? This is also something you guys can yell out. Money, exactly, right? So the main thing that we've used as a society to measure anything, so let's think about this from 3 different aspects. As an individual, people have thought about the money you make as a societal structure, the money you save, and the money you spend. When we think about brands and we think about companies, we again think about the same thing. We think about what their balance sheet looks like, how much money they've earned, how many products they've sold. When we think about government, we think the same thing, right? Is the government, and obviously simplifying down here, is there a surplus to the government? Are we in a deficit? What are we trading? What's inputting, what's outputting, what's exporting, what's importing. So this is traditionally what we've been leveraging to be a tool of measurement. Now, in today's day and age, what if we can't use money anymore, right? Think about what life is like now experientially. The things that we do today aren't instantly monetizable at all. The things that we spend our time on, so say for example, if you're pulling up a cat video on Facebook and spending about 2 minutes of your time watching that, how is that monetized? That cat video is not directly monetized, right? Maybe you'll see some ads around it, maybe you'll see some other things, but watching that video is not monetizable. Consuming content for the sake of consuming content is also not monetizable. And so if we can't use money anymore as our proxy to understand where our time goes, what do we use? Attention, exactly, right? If you read the title in this book, you totally know that. So attention today is kind of our proxy, right? It's the currency of today. The things that we do and the way that we move in society as we move toward an experiential state is figuring out where people place their time, where people place their eyeballs, and where people will choose to, flip on that channel. So if that's the case today, and attention's our new proxy, and we can't necessarily use money anymore, how do we win in an environment like that? What are the strategies to actually start driving behavior toward getting more attention? And I'll kind of caveat this up front by saying, I've spent the last 10 years working on driving attention without actually knowing what that meant. So people use terms, which I'm sure everybody here has heard of. People talk about driving more engagement. People try to talk about making things more sticky. People talk about getting more click-throughs. People talk about more time spent on device. All these things. But these were all proxies at the end of the day for just where my attention went, right? So, after kind of understanding that for the last 10 years, there's kind of 3 main content strategies or 3 definitive strategies that we've started using to actually get people to come into an experience and stay in that experience. So the first one that I want to share with you guys is understanding how content works. So as you've noticed with all these platforms, content scales. In fact, content goes to infinity, but our ability to consume, meaning our ability to eat that content, does not. So we're still strategically rate limited. And because we're rate limited, we have to have a heuristic, or we have to have a methodology to be able to understand how that goes, why that goes, and when that goes. And those things are called values, right? We as human beings have values. There are things that we are willing to do. There are things that we're also hopefully not willing to do. And if that's the case, the content that seems to align most with what our values are seems to be the stuff that gets consumed most often. And so whenever you're thinking about placing things out for attention, you have to be very careful about understanding the value that you place on that and what sort of kind of moralistic imperative that you have on the content at the same time. The second thing that actually really matters is curation. So, we're a community. Content, for some reason, has become a group activity. So it's not just about sitting at home by yourself anymore. It's about consuming the things that other people consume, right? So social networks have made this today's reality, where you will look at things, you will find things, and you will interact with things that your friends have chosen to like. You will intentionally avoid things that people who you don't like or people that you don't deal with have said are great. We're finding this in the US right now. The advent of the left and the right, and obviously this is a global phenomenon, but we see it very acutely in the US, saying that, hey, I'm a conservative, I'm somewhere on the right, these are my values, and these are the things that I think are okay, and that my peer group says are okay. Everything else from the other side, I don't believe. And so I'm not going to pay attention to any of that. Doesn't matter if it's true, doesn't matter if it's a fact. All that matters is that my peer group has said that it's not. And so that's the only stuff that I'm going to pay attention to. And my behavior is driven simply by that community. So you have to be very careful about how curation happens. Because this concept that they've started talking about today, which is called a filter bubble, is readily apparent. And it's been apparent for a very long time from even small group conversations, but now it's got digital scale as it moves into a much larger context. And then finally, this is probably antithetical to what most people say, but I will say that when it comes to driving behavior, simplicity counts. So think about what today's life is like, especially with the amount of content that's presented. Everybody wants more, right? The way that advertisers try to get to you, the way that products try to get to you is that they constantly say, let's give you more, 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 more. Here's a new feature. Here's a new piece of content. Here's something else for you to do all the time. And eventually, they just drive you insane because there's so many things that you can never have true mastery. You can never truly understand what's going on, and you're just trying to ride the wave as it comes along. But at the end of the day, do you really get what something was about? Do you really get that information embedded in a way that makes some sort of indelible mark? And the honest truth is that you don't. What people want is information given to them in a way that makes sense and is actually digestible. So when you think about designing, or when you think about actually capturing attention, less is more. That principle actually works in today's world because this overall bombardment just doesn't work anymore. So, sorry, I can't tell how much time is left because this thing reset. Got it. All right. So, just I'll put it together this way. So, money today still matters, right? It's still the model for utility, but attention is the proxy that we have to use to measure things. So, actions we're taking, products we're building, information we're putting out, all those things put together can use attention as a proxy to actually understand what works and what doesn't. People have choices today, just like you guys have the choice to stop paying attention right now. Thank you.